Okay, creatives. In this video, we are going to explore the tremendous power of custom filters. As we continue to add more and more rows and columns to our template, we will want to rely on the custom filter feature in our spreadsheet to help us limit the data our template displays according to different needs. The use of custom filters can both build upon and extend the features we added to our template in the previous video using freeze panes and groups. If you're following along from our course downloads, the file name of the spreadsheet we are using in this video is STH 1.15. Let's pop over to Excel to look at the file now. On screen, we're in the manual worksheet where we left off in the previous video. This is just a copy of where we left off last time. We're going to navigate over now to the template worksheet. We are done with manual for now. The template worksheet is a copy of our manual worksheet, but instead of sum additions, we have sum ifs, and I've added two new columns, which we'll come to in a minute. Let's just take a look at those sum if calculations. If you are confused at all by these sum if calculations, please watch the sum versus sum if video where I go into detail. Here we have a sum if for our sum downs, and it's the same formula across all of our sum downs. We have a sum if function where our range is our parent account numbers, and our criteria is the account number for the row that we're currently trying to sum. And then our sum range is for the column that we're trying to sum. So that sum if formula works across all of our sum downs. And we have a sum if calculation as well for our sum across. So in earned revenues here for our sum down, it's still a sum down. Rather than a sum across, we could do either a sum across or a sum down. I've chosen sum down. But for our child accounts, we are using a sum if across. And so instead of parent as its range and account number as its criteria, the range is row 3, where in row 3, I have set a value using a value list dropdown in the template tab here called list for the names of our groups for the subtotals. And the group names used in this template is just very simply 1 and 2. So we have in columns K, M, and O for our projected project columns called A, B, and C, we have added in row 3 above those project header names a value that connects to what the name of the subtotal group is. We have 1 for K, M, and O, and we have 2 as the group name for the sum for the subtotal group 2, which sums S, U, and W columns. So the sum if range is the entire row 3 where those data points are included. If I wanted, the sum range could be the entire template from the left to the right. It doesn't really matter. And probably for good practices, that would be a nice thing to do. But in the first sum, I had just done it this way. We can change it to that. And then the sum range, the optional amount, which we want for our sum if, is the row that we're trying to sum. And it's all the way from column I to column W. And so it's going to include a sum if for our subtotal in column 2 there as well. But it's not going to sum that amount at all because there is no number in row 3 for the range that's to be selected. It's only going to sum where there is a number in row 3, so the columns we've already discussed. I want to sum from column I all the way over to the end, column W, so that when I insert new subtotals and new projects, the sum is automatically going to include those. as long as I identify which sum they belong to in row 3 above their names. Okay, so now essentially we have, for our entire template here, we have only 2 formulas that we need, one for sum across and one for sum down. And that's going to work whether it's a tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 account, whatever tier it is. That same sum will work for sum across and sum downs. Really, the only difference between them is their formatting. So tier 1 has a nice dark blue, dark green, dark purple, and tier 2 has a light gray background instead with a colored font rather than a white font for those same colors. All right, so that's basically how this template is organized. I have added in manually from our previous video, I've manually added our outlines for our columns and rows. As I mentioned in the previous video, auto outline by Excel requires a sum function rather than SUMIF to create auto outlines. And I'm using SUMIF in this template, so auto outline is not really going to get us much of what we need. So I've had to go in and manually create each of these ranges. So I can hide and unhide the different column details as well as the different rows. Okay, so that's an introduction to this version of our template. The new thing that has been added is in row 6, and that's a filter. It is a drop-down icon, which looks very much like the icon for our value list. It's an upside-down triangle in a rounded square. And clicking on that will give us a bunch of filter options from sort smallest to largest to largest to smallest, and many others. How do we add this filter across all of our columns? Well, we're going to select this row, and for our filter, I normally always create an empty row directly below the project status and project header for our columns. So I can add this row of filter in there. But we go to, once we have the row selected by just clicking on row 6, the header for that row, we can go to data, and under sort and filter, there is a nice big funnel icon with filter under it. That's the one we want to toggle the filter on or off. So I already had it on, so now it is off. To turn it back on, I go to data and click on the funnel icon again. And now it has added a filter for any columns that have data in them. So that is for columns A all the way over to column Y. It doesn't create a filter in column Z or additional columns after it because there's no data to filter there. Let's take a look at what the filter will do before we talk about some very important caveats and warnings around the use of filters that you must understand and abide by to prevent your template from breaking. But let's look at how we use them first. So let's select our Project A column under Subtotal 1 grouping and click in the drop-down filter. I don't really want to use sort smallest to largest or largest to smallest in this local context because our accounts for our financial chart are already displayed sort ascending by account number. So I could go over there and filter smallest to largest, or if I wanted to change the view, I could change it to sort largest to smallest, although that's going to really mess up our sums to a certain degree in terms of how they are displayed. The financial math is going to be exactly the same because everything is based on account number and parent account number. So as long as that is good, all the sums are going to work, but the displays aren't quite what I would like to see. So I'm going to avoid doing that and return it back to sort smallest to largest so we get the view I'm expecting to see. If I try to sort ascending smallest to largest here, we're likely to get an error. But we can try. It worked. Okay. But now we have that account order that isn't quite how I'd like to see it. So I'm going to go back and sort smallest to largest. If you filter out using something else other than sort, such as the numbered filter, and let's choose, there's so many options here: equals, does not equal, greater than, less than, between, top 10, averages, and custom. Let's choose between. If we choose this one and filter out the data, is greater than 1000 and is less than or equal to 2500, that is going to work. That is going to give us a filtered result of data in project A, or sum total number 1 that is between those two numbers. But I can't now sort that ascending because it's already a filtered result. It just doesn't want to do multiple sorts or filters on the same column. However, I can have multiple sorts or filters across multiple columns. So I can go to project B here, and rather than selecting numbered filters and something like greater than or less than, I can unselect all here and just choose 1000 and 1500 in the drop-down list. And I'll get a second filtered list for column B that meets the filtered requirements for both column A and column B. We get a smaller list. I could then, I think, sort in column C, smallest to largest. No, that's not going to work. We're going to get the filter and group sort error notice. So it really doesn't like to filter and sort. It's either or. Either you sort or you filter. You can't do both. But you can create multiple filters across multiple columns. The only evidence to your eye that a column has been filtered or is not filtered is the change in the icon for that column filter from a upside down triangle when it's not filtered to a small funnel icon. And sometimes that's hard to see when you have many columns or you have many filters. I wish it would turn blue or something like that. Just like in the filtered results, the row numbers are turned blue by this feature of our filter. They also have double stroked gray lines as the dividers between the row numbers, which is a little bit hard to see on most screens, but it is there as extra evidence. You can also see that the row results are filtered because there is no longer an incremental increase in row numbers. We go from 21 to 31 and 31 to 37 and 6 to 20. So that can help you notice that you have a filter result and that you haven't lost your data. The other data is just currently hidden rather than being shown. We can turn off an individual column filter by selecting from the drop-down clear filter. Or you can do all of them at once by selecting the row that has your filter in it, and under data, click clear. And we'll get all of our results back. Okay, so that's the basics of the preset options for our filter. Let's talk about some caveats and warnings next. The first caveat with filters is that you cannot have a fully empty row below the row that has the filter turned on. You must have at least one item in one column in any row for the filter to work all the way down to the bottom. In row 22, we have 99 as a number in this tier column, and we're going to come back to column C in a minute in our tier. I have some data in there, but if I remove that, and now I have a fully empty row from all the way from A to Y, there is no data anywhere. When I filter, my filter results will not show past row 22. It's going to stop. So that's helpful if you want to check something. Just insert an empty row and your filter is not going to go any further. But if you want your filter to continue, you need to have some dummy row, some kind of dummy data in that row in at least one column. Hence why I've added the number 99 in the tier for that row, so that when I do filter, it's going to continue past that row, even though there's no data in any of the columns that I really want to filter for our financial information. There's no data there. Having 99 in column C is essential for the filter to work from top to bottom. That's the first caveat. The second caveat is a warning. Please take this warning deeply into account and try not to forget it, because if you do, and then you do what I'm suggesting you don't do, you are likely going to break your template and cause all kinds of heartache. So the warning here as our caveat is when you've turned your filter on, it's going to select, as we've mentioned, only those columns that have data in their rows. But if you want to insert another column with a filter, you can only insert a column when your filter is turned on that is in between two columns that already have a filter. So that means I can only insert columns between column B or after column A and before column Y. So that'll work great if I am here at column D and I want to insert a column before column D. I can right click on the column header for D and insert. And an empty column is going to be added, and the filter by default will be added to that column. That is exactly what we want to have happen. However, if I insert a column before column A, it's going to insert that new column, but the filter is not going to be turned on by default for that column. And when I enter in data in that column, say I want 4,400 in with box office subscriptions, and we want 5,550 for co-productions. When I go in and filter, and just as an example, I'm going to sort the account numbers largest to smallest. What I want to have happen with the filter is I want to keep 4,440 with box office subscriptions and 5,550 with co-productions. But with no filter in column A here turned on, when I filter, watch what happens. They do not move. They stay in the rows they were assigned in when I entered them. They do not get filtered with the rows that they were assigned with in my mind because the filter is not turned on. When you insert that new column at the beginning, you must make sure, if you don't want your template to be broken and you want to keep these row associations for your data, you must select your filter row, go to data, turn it off, and then turn it back on. So your new column will have a filter for that dropdown. Now when I sort largest to smallest, that row data stays with box office subscriptions and co-productions. That association is kept. So that's the case of adding a column at the beginning. And while it doesn't make a lot of sense because we have all kinds of empty columns at the end here, if I insert a column at the end after the last column that has a filter turned on, which is Z, that new column is also not going to have a filter turned on by default. So you're going to want to do that same thing, turn off the filter and turn it back on so that your new column has a filter associated with it as well. Okay, so that's our warnings and caveats around using our filter. Let's take a look at these two additional columns that I have added to our template in column C for tier and column Z for show. I'm going to delete our AA column, which we don't need. What is in our C column here? The template that I am building for my own organization has a large number of revenue, expense, and other accounts in the financial chart of accounts. And with SumIf, as we've mentioned, we cannot use auto outline. So I have to manually define those ranges if I'm going to use the outline features here. And I'm just noticing that our sums are not in account number order. So I'm going to resort them back to smallest to largest. So I have how I want the template to be viewed back. So I have gone in and manually created the child ranges for the columns and the rows, but that's a time consuming process. When we have SumIf, we just have to do it manually. The auto outline doesn't work well. So there is another way that if your template is really complicated and you have many nested layers or tiers of accounts that sum up too, then this tier column will be really helpful. So I've just named, okay, what tier are each of these accounts? Revenue is the highest level, so it is tier 1. Earned revenues is tier 2. It is a parent of revenues, and all those other parents of revenues are also identified in column C as tier 2. Then I don't have any additional sums, but those would be tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, etc. as we go through the different nested levels. But in this version of the template, the next level is just data entry. So I've started with 9, 8 as the number for the rows that I want to have data entry in. In the final template, this number I believe will be 97. For a good reason, but for now, it is just 98 that we're using as an example here for each of the data entry rows. And then I've used 99 as the ID number for our tier for these blank rows. Now, if I don't want to use the auto outline, so imagine I have outlines defined here, but I could turn those off by selecting the full range and going to data and ungroup. And that will take out the first tier. And clicking again will take out the second tier of our rows because I've selected the rows only, not the columns. I've retained the outlines for our columns. I no longer have those outlines, so I only have toggles for the columns up at the top here. I don't have toggles for our rows. We can use the tier filter in column C to get us that same toggle. It's not quite as easy to use, but when we have multiple tier levels like 10 or 12 or more, I find using the filter a little bit takes up less space, less screen real estate. And I don't need it that often. So I don't mind unselecting all and then just choosing one if I just want to see our total, which would be revenues, expenses, surplus deficit for the year, and accumulated surplus deficit would be our tier 1 accounts when we are completed building out our income statement here. And then we could toggle on and turn on 2 if we want to see those child accounts. So it's a little bit more of a step than just going over and clicking on 1 or 2 for our columns. To do the same for the rows, we need to do the drop down and then select the ones that we want. So we could turn on and get those data entry accounts by selecting 98. And we can add back in those empty rows by selecting 99. In this version of the template, I'd like to add that I've just formatted each of the rows for data entry with that same dotted line at the bottom of the row that we have used in the list value list tab here, just to help us note that those are the rows that and columns that will accept data entry. Whereas our sum columns are in a color, not just black, and there are no lines. They are white backgrounds with no lines on any of the borders, just as an indication that no data entry is wanted or expected there. The lines also help us as we are scanning across the rows to make sure that we're lining up. Just a little bit easier to see. If you want to change the color of those background borders, you can go ahead and change the styles. As I mentioned in the previous video, these are all manually defined styles for this worksheet. I have not used tables or table styles for the design of this template yet. We're going to come to tables in a future video. So wait for that. We can use that tier to help us display our various tiers and replace the manually defined ranges for groups. We can also use in the show column, I have created a formula that will give us an additional level of options around displaying and hiding rows. So what this is doing is we'll display a yes if there is a value that is greater than or less than 0 in our total column here. So essentially, if there is money somewhere in one of these columns, any of them, it doesn't really matter, in our total, there is a number that is less than or greater than 0, it will display a yes in the show filter. If across the columns and our total addition is 0 equals 0, then display a no under the show filter. And if there is no data at all in the total column here, then display OPT, which is my short form for optional display. Now I can use the drop-down filter and just select yes only for seeing only those accounts that have data in them. And at the moment, there's only one row here that doesn't have any data. But if I delete all the data that is here, for example, and here, we're going to see when I select yes here, all of these rows that have no in the show are going to be hidden. When I deselect, select all, and choose just yes, all of those rows are going to disappear. As we build out our template in this single worksheet, we're going to have multiple years, multiple operating budgets across multiple years with many project columns underneath each one, which may be the same or may be different in their groupings. We can work on that. But with this template, we can now decide to show only those accounts that have numbers in them. And we might be using completely different accounts for 1 year compared to the next. And as we work on our template, this show feature is going to take that into account. And so we'll be able to compare 1 year to the next, even if there is no data in 1 year, but there is in another. And that's going to really help us when we have a large template with a large number of financial accounts. Say we have 500 revenue and expense accounts in our financial chart. And in a particular budget, we only enter data in, say, 5 or 12 rows. Then using this show feature here and drop down yes, we can just narrow in and only display those accounts that have numbers in them and hide the rest. If we select the option value, then I'm going to add back in those empty rows, which could help us for accessibility, just to give us a bit of white space. But if we're wanting to print without them, so we're taking up less paper, then we can turn that off. And if we want to see those empty rows again, then we can select no and optional, and we are back in terms of our display, seeing all the accounts that we have. So that's one use of a custom filter where we're using a formula to give us an option that is variable in our show column, and then we can filter based on those. We haven't even looked at the formula that's in here. it's using what's called an if-else function. That's an if statement in a series. So in a future video, let's discuss this formula, this if-else function, and how it works. But for now, we'll just summarize by saying the if-else statement does a bunch of if-then statements. If a certain criteria is met, then do this. And so the formula here is checking if column G and the row that we're summing currently for the show, if that data is blank, then give us one option, which is the OPT option. And that option here is noted as list I5. That's in our list tab. So there is a value list for these options. So if column G is blank for that row, then display, which is in I5 in list, that is the OPT value. If this value in G for our row is equal to 0, then display, which is in list I4, and that's our option no. And then there is an OR statement, which compares if the value is either less than 0 or greater than 0, then display what is in list I3, and that is our yes option. We'll go into the if-else and if function in another video, but we can just go over to our list tab to finish off this video and see in column I have a display value list set up here with options of yes, no, and OPT for optional. So I'm using those items in our formula for the show. It's just pulling those values. So if I want to change those to be Y and O for short form, then our template is going to change to YN and O instead of yes, no, and OPT. So I think that's enough to illustrate the power and potential of filters. In our next video, let's take a look at another feature in our spreadsheet to continue extending what we can do with our template. I'll see you there.